On April 2nd, US President Donald Trump fulfilled a pledge.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them.
The giant printout signaled a major turn toward US protectionism, one that hit South Africa particularly hard.
The presidency says it is concerned about the newly imposed tariffs on South African exports to the United States.
And there were these additional taxes, Mfundo, on some 60 countries, and that's where South Africa was part of the list that he put up on that board.
How the US arrived at this calculation of some sort of a 60% tariff, and then they decided on a 30% tariff to impose on South Africa.
The rand surged as the dollar slid to a 3-month low. US stock benchmarks suffered their steepest one-day losses since 2020, and leading world economies struck back. Within days, domestic markets were shaken by talk that the DA might pull out of the GNU, only to be rocked again when a US congressman tabled a bill to reassess Washington's ties with South Africa. Then, only hours after the steepest tariffs kicked in on April 9th,
United States President Donald Trump has announced a 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs.
Most nations, South Africa among them, face only a 10% levy, yet the tariff still threatens to further undercut AGOA. So where does that leave us? How is this supposed to function over the long haul? Is AGOA's future at risk? And what awaits once the new 90-day countdown runs out? Recently, US President Donald Trump announced tariffs of at least 30% on all South African exports to the United States as part of a broader set of global trade measures. An annex to Trump's executive order, released after his public briefing, detailed slight increases in certain tariffs, raising South Africa's rate to 31%. Initially, these 31% tariffs took effect on Wednesday, April 9th. However, later that day, Trump reversed course, granting a 90-day pause for countries, South Africa included, that had entered negotiations with his administration and had not imposed retaliatory tariffs. Despite the pause, a blanket 10% import tariff from the Trump administration remains in place and continues to apply to South African exports. This change means that South African exports previously enjoying duty-free access under the African Growth and Opportunity Act are now subject to a 10% tariff. The original 31% tariff was calculated using a formula that halved what the US claimed was a 60% average tariff on American goods entering South Africa. And this is the formula that was used. Now let's explain what each symbol represents in this situation. DTI, this is the change in the tariff for product I. How much more or less tax to put on it when it's imported. SHE, this is how much of product I the US is exporting. MI, this is how much of product I the US is importing. Epsilon, this is a number that shows how sensitive trade is to price changes. It's called elasticity and basically just means how much people change their buying behavior if prices go up. PHI, this is a number that reflects how much market power the US has. In other words, how much it can influence world prices. MII, again, the import amount shows up again in the bottom. It's just used to normalize the formula. In simple terms, the Trump administration looked at how much product they're selling to other countries and compared it to how much they're buying from other countries. If they're bringing in a lot more than they're sending out, maybe they should raise the tariff to protect American businesses. That's pretty much the thinking that went into that. For example, in the case of South Africa, the US took its goods trade deficit with the country, divided it by the total value of imports from South Africa, and halved the result to determine the tariff rate, which is how we got to that 31%. In essence, a trade deficit arises when the US imports more goods from a country than it exports to it. However, the White House's official methodology document reveals that this formula was not applied uniformly. The tariff rates were instead set with the goal of eliminating the US's goods trade deficit with each country, rather than through a consistent mathematical approach. In some cases, Trump appears to have departed from the stated formula entirely, imposing tariffs even on countries with which the US actually has a trade surplus. Many commentators have pointed out that the new US tariffs are not truly reciprocal, and they're right. Reciprocity would mean the tariffs are based on what other countries already charge the US, including not just direct tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers, like regulatory costs that raise the price of doing business. In South Africa's case, tariffs on US imports averaged just 7.5%. By Trump's own logic, a reciprocal tariff would be closer to 3.75%. But facts didn't seem to carry much weight in this decision. According to the head of AGOA Global Trade Advisors, in a report published with the Daily Maverick, the 30% duty slapped on South African goods, on top of a blanket 25% tariff on auto imports imposed globally on March 26th, effectively cancels out the benefits South Africa previously enjoyed under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA. Trump noted that South Africa exported around 153 billion rand worth of goods to the US last year, about half of which were mineral products. US officials said that 35 to 40% of South Africa's 2024 exports would be exempt from the 30% tariff, mainly in the minerals and energy sectors. The Minerals Council South Africa welcomed the exemption of key exports such as platinum group metals, PGMs, manganese, coal and gold, which together account for 76% of South African mineral exports to the US, but warned of broader economic consequences beyond the mining sector. Unfortunately, most of South Africa's exports under AGOA were not exempt from the initial 30% tariff. As a result, many in the country now view AGOA as effectively defunct. A 30% tariff renders the average 3.5% preferential benefit South Africa previously enjoyed under AGOA virtually meaningless. AGOA itself is set to expire in September, and its renewal appears unlikely, especially given Trump's strong opposition to non-reciprocal trade agreements and free trade in general. Trump has long argued that many US trading partners benefit from low tariffs when exporting to the US, while maintaining high import duties on American goods. Following the announcement of those tariffs, the South African presidency issued a statement expressing concern. While reaffirming the country's commitment to a mutually beneficial trade relationship with the United States, the statement criticized the unilateral and punitive nature of the tariffs, saying they hinder trade and shared economic growth. The US is South Africa's second-largest export market, accounting for nearly 10% of the country's total exports. For the past 20 years, about a quarter of South Africa's exports to the US benefited from duty-free access under AGOA. Now those goods are expected to face significant tariffs. While the current rate is 10%, that could change at any time. Sectors already feeling the impact include agriculture, the wine industry, and boat manufacturing, with the US being South Africa's largest market for recreational craft. Vehicle exports are also expected to take a hit as the new tariffs take effect. As we wrap up this video, it's important to recognize that South Africa's inclusion in AGOA has long been a contentious issue for both Republican and Democratic administrations. However, recent diplomatic strains between the US and South Africa, coupled with Trump's vocal criticism of trade ties involving China, Russia, and India, all fellow BRICS nations, have brought new urgency to the conversation. If AGOA is ultimately revoked, the consequences will be most deeply felt by workers. In a country already facing one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, the loss of thousands more jobs would be a devastating blow. Tariffs and export restrictions threaten economic growth and job security across critical sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and the automotive industry. If you're wondering what happens next and what all of this really means for South Africa, check out this video where we explore the potential fallout of losing AGOA